so powerful and glorious is that became the standard because the Jews also became Hellenized. Yeah, a lot of the scribes and stuff still spoke Hebrew, but the Greek text of the Bible, of the Old Testament.
Thank you for joining me on the Unrefined Podcast. I am Brandon Spain, along with Lindsay Waters and BT Wallace, and this is where we explore the mysteries of the universe, uncover new perspectives, and discuss the seen and unseen through a lens of biblical truth. For more content and exclusive resources, visit us at unrefinedpodcast.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode. Hey, you guys. Our guest today is a master of storytelling, a deep diver into the ancient world, a man who unearths hidden layers of biblical history most people overlook. His work takes us beyond the surface into the supernatural. He's tackled everything from fallen angels to the Nephilim, from ancient gods to end times prophecy, and now he's pulling back the veil on a time of war, rebellion, and divine intervention. Get ready to rethink what you thought you knew about history, mythology, and the Bible. Today, we're welcoming the one and only Brian Godawa. How you doing, Brian?
Good, man. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, we're excited. We are super excited about having you on there.
Chronicles of the Watchers is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history, a war of gods and men. Jezebel, harlot queen of Israel, Moses against the gods of Egypt, and other supernatural historical novels in the series Chronicles of the Watchers. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
So I'm just going to get us started just with kind of a basic question. So what made you, Brian, decide to write about the Maccabees? I'm assuming you're a Protestant like I am, and I mean, I'm an Anglican, so it's in my Bible, but it's still not scripture to us. And
yeah,
but what made you want to dive into the apocryphal? That second time temple time period. What drew you to want to look at this and write about this?
Sure. Well, first of all, I've always been curious about the Apocrypha as, and like you said, I am a Protestant, and so I've never accepted it as scripture. But I've been curious about the Apocrypha, and I've loved learning about it. And I did do a little bit study into it, looking it up. And it's very fascinating and some very interesting, relevant things to our faith. Where to begin? So the Apocrypha. So the book of the Maccabees are in the Apocrypha, and I've known that. It takes place in this time period around 160. The story I'm telling is around 168 BC, the time of the Maccabees. They begin a war, and that's in a certain time period between the two testaments. So that's a curious thing to me. Like, scripturally, we're told that the last prophet was Malachi. That was around 400 BC and of course, Malachi, one of the last things he says is, the next prophet will be Elijah proclaiming the day of the Lord, proclaiming the coming of Messiah. Right? Yeah. And so then John the Baptist Jesus said John the Baptist was Elijah. Theologians call it the period of God's silence. That's very interesting. Why? Why is God silent? He's not speaking through his prophets. He's not speaking to his people. Not only that, but also realizing that from the time of the exile, God's Spirit had left the temple. And the temple is God's house in Jerusalem. That's how it's described, and that's how it's understood. But Ezekiel, the prophet, talks about how he saw the Spirit of God leaving the temple during the exile, which makes sense, right? Conceptually at least, right? Oh, the Babylonians are coming, they're destroying the temple, they're taking it away, and my people have not obeyed me, so God withdraws his presence. And it never returns. You hear in the other consequent prophets that Yahweh will return to Zion. Yahweh will return to Zion. Well, when Jesus comes and he talks about his parables, he talks about Yahweh returning to Zion in him. He is the Messiah. He is Yahweh returning to Zion. So again, it's like God's Spirit is withdrawn. He's not speaking to them. And, another additional component that's part of this time period is during the days of the Maccabees, the high priesthood, which again, remember that the temple is the focal point of the religion of Judaistic religion. And it's where the sacrifices, atonement is made, it is their interactive mechanism with their God. And so the high priesthood was considered very holy. And at that time period, Israel had no king because they were the subjects of the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemies back and forth. We'll talk about that. But point being that the high priest became actually very crucial in as a figurehead. He became kind of the president of Israel as both religious and political, in other words, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so what's important about that is the Menelaus is the high priest of this time period, and he is the first high priest who's not of the Zadokite line in the Aaronic priesthood. And that was blasphemous because, all the high priests had to be of the Zadokite line. And from that time forward, now we'll be talking about him probably because he's also in my story, Judah Maccabee. Mm-hmm. So he bribes King Antiochus, who's the king of the Greeks, king of the Seleucid kingdom. And that's how he gets in. And then from his point on until Christ, there's no legitimate high priest. They're all from the Maccabean line and the Hasmonean line, and then none of them are in the Zadokite priesthood. And then Herod takes over before Christ, right? And we know Herod is also not. He's an Edomite, right? So and of course his high priests are of his lineage and such. So very fascinating how this concept is God is relationally withdrawn from Israel. And that all goes back to the exile, and how the Jews had continued to worship idols and did not keep God's Sabbaths. And so he says, I'm going to punish you for 70 years. Jeremiah talks about the 70 years of exile. And then in 70 years, they come back. But what's interesting is Daniel, the prophet Daniel, is during that exile. And he gets a vision that says, okay, you're going to come back to the land, but there's going to be an extension of the judgment of 70 times 7. That's what we call the prophecy of the 70 weeks or the 77s, meaning that there's still going to be God is, the whole book of Daniel is about God. God is appointing 4 Gentile kingdoms who are described as beasts, among other things, right, that are going to rule over Israel until Messiah comes.
Yeah, I never realized the correlation between the book of Maccabees and Daniel until I read how intertwined they were.
Yeah, and I kind of knew about it. I'd known that, Daniel actually prophesies about all these kingdoms, doesn't he? We know about the Babylonian kingdom. We know about the Medo-Persian kingdom that he describes the events, and they occur in Daniel's lifetime. But Daniel goes beyond that, and he actually describes the elements of the Greek kingdom that would be Alexander the Great would ultimately take over, and then Rome would ultimately take over Greek. And so the latter part of Daniel does address those issues so much so directly that in Daniel 8 and 11, he's describing this Greek kingdom. And in Daniel 11, which has always been a very bizarre chapter to me because I couldn't make sense of it, heads or tails, because it just talks about the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north will fight the king of the south, and the king of the south will do this, and the king of the north will do that. And it goes on, and it goes back and forth, and it covers a long time period. And you're like, what's going on? And, I know many Christians probably think that has to do with our future, but it actually doesn't. Most scholars do acknowledge that is a reference to the Syrian Wars, which were Syria was owned by the Greek Seleucids. And this is around 250 BC or so, but the Maccabees are around 168 BC. But the Seleucids become the kings of the north, meaning it's north of Israel. And then what's south of Israel? Egypt. The kings of the south are the Greek Ptolemies. Yeah. They were also rulers, and they were battling between each other. Israel was in between them, and they would sometimes be the victims of that battle, right? And the battling over control. That's the Greek kingdom split. And that's what Daniel 11 is talking about. Lo and behold, and we're getting closer to this, but Daniel 11, talking about these various kings. And here's the thing, that if you look at that chapter, those actions of the kings of the north and south, king of the north is Syria, Seleucids. King of the south is the Ptolemies. They match the 6 Syrian wars that occurred. So, of course, this happens after Alexander's death. Alexander dies, he conquers the world, he dies, and then his kingdom split up between some of his generals. One was Seleucus, one was Ptolemy, and there were some others, but the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were the dominant interest because they are the ones that have to do with Israel, right? And so the first Syrian War was around 270 BC, 274 BC.
Okay.
And it follows so exactly what really did happen in history that liberal theologians will tell you the book of Daniel must have been written during the days of the Maccabees because it follows history too perfectly. And we all know prophecy is impossible. I mean, that sounds absurd, but that's literally why they come to the conclusion that Daniel was actually a pseudonymous fake work written by someone in the name of Daniel, because Daniel was around 586 BC, right? And the Maccabees and the Syrian Wars are 270 BC. So that's a big time gap. So they say, well, prophecy can't be true. And this is so exact that he must have written it after the events and made it look like it was prophecy. But that just kind of shows you, that's an argument for, if you want to know, how do we know this interpretation is the best interpretation of the prophecy? Well, it's pretty universally acknowledged how exact it fits history. Mm-hmm. So that's fascinating. But in the middle of that, or shall we say at the end of that, the sixth Syrian War, we're down to Daniel 11. He talks about these various kings, and the kings are changing because it's over a long period of time. So the one king he starts talking about, which is in verse 21, in his place shall arise a contemptible person. Some translations have it despicable or vile, and to whom royal majesty has not been given, but it talks about him becoming a king. And that, of course, that actually fits Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who became king around 170 BC or something like that. And it then takes several paragraphs to focus in on this one king. Why? Well, because it's focused around the temple. And it describes things that he will do, of which are this. You'll see down in verse 31. Forces from him, this king, shall appear and profane the temple and fortress. So that's talking about Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple, because this is, of course, Daniel speaking, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. That's exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes did. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate, or the abomination of desolation. And it continues on to describe, again, the time of the Maccabees, right? And that fits exactly, because what King Antiochus IV did was he set up a statue of Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem, and tried to force the Jews to give up their religion, give up circumcision, give up their covenant, and force them to become truly Hellenized, fully Hellenized, and even sacrifice to Zeus and eat pork and all this.
Yeah.
They call it, you can see why this would be so important to find its way into prophecy, right? Because that is a center point of their faith and such. And this is the time of the Maccabees. And this is what draws my interest to that story of the Maccabees. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's not in the Bible, but it's connected to the Bible, right? Now, there are also Catholics, the Roman Catholic Bibles and Eastern Orthodox Bibles do actually include the books of Maccabees or the Apocrypha in their scripture. Some of the Roman Catholic calls it deuterocanonical, which is sort of second canon. It's not primary, but it is secondary, right? But throughout all of history, when you look into the Apocrypha, you'll find that throughout all of Christian history, from the early church fathers up to and including the Reformation, Calvin and all those guys, they did not consider the Apocrypha to be scripture, but they considered it to be, it's worthy of education and worthy of teaching and instruction. And so the point here is you don't have to accept it as scripture to be able to appreciate for its historical context. And this is Jewish history, and it's worthy of that story. And of course, because it's not as well known, people should find it very fascinating and interesting. And that's why I wrote the novels, Judah Maccabee Parts 1 and 2. Now, tonight we'll be talking about the details behind it. And I also wrote a book called The Spiritual World of Ancient Israel and Greece. And that was all the theological, biblical background to my novels. That's what I tend to do. And so we'll talk about that book today. But the heart of it is this story of Judah Maccabee and this, when Antiochus did this, painting the context a little bit. Antiochus is a Seleucid king, and he has, Israel in his clutches at that time, but he thinks that Israel's going to revolt against him. or is revolting. And so that's why he sends his army and they slaughter these Jews and he sets up this abomination, right? So what's the abomination of desolation? When you hear that word, a lot of people know prophecy. Oh, prophecy, right? Jesus said, well, it's a little complicated in that the word abomination is basically a reference to any idolatrous images that are abominable to God. So statues of deities or whatever. And then desolation is a term that means to make desolate, or think of a desert. It's desolate, right? And that could be reference to either God's presence or the spiritual desolation of, well, if you put an image of a false god in God's house, he's going to withdraw, isn't he? He's like, I will have no gods before me. Yeah. So God's presence is desolate and the spirituality is desolate. And that's kind of what that thing means. So when he puts up a statue of Zeus, Olympius in the temple, that's an abomination. But here's the thing. A lot of Jews at that time were Hellenized, and some of them accepted it and gave up their covenant obligations and tried to become good Greeks, so to speak, because the whole world had been very influenced by it. But then some Jews did not, and they were called the Hasidim, and they're the holy ones, and they were the ones who refused to obey that king. Well, that means death, because what happened is King Antiochus then martyred, he murdered, tortured, and murdered many Jews who would refuse to eat pork. And in the books of the Maccabees, there's extended descriptions of the torturing that was done to these. One of them was a woman and her 7 sons, and the description of each of them being tortured. And it's gruesome in one sense, but the point of it is to show how serious it is to remain true to God, even when your life and you're going to be tortured for it. And this wasn't just, the thing was, if you eat pork, I'll let you go, right? But we know that it's not just not eating food. That's part of the covenant of their covenant obligation to God. So they took it seriously. Well, that martyrdom then became a rallying cry for revolt. And Judah Maccabee and his 4 brothers and their father, Mattathiah, they were a family of priests, and they were living in Modin, about 13 miles west of Jerusalem, right? Well, they rose up and killed the Greek soldiers in their city and refused to do sacrifices in their city like you're supposed to. And then they ran off into the wilderness, and men joined them because, they knew that they would probably come and destroy the city if they stuck around, right? So they became a guerrilla army. And then over the next 3 years, he grew to be 10,000 men, to the point where they ended up being able to, they were fighting the Greek army as guerrillas, and then they ended up taking Jerusalem back, destroying the abomination of desolation, cleansing the temple, and restoring it to its holiness. And that's where we get the holiday Hanukkah, or the festival of Hanukkah. It's not in the Bible, it's not commanded in the Bible, but modern Jews still celebrate that because that was the restoration of the temple. And there's other things connected to, supposed miracles and such, but that's kind of the big picture story of what I'm telling in my novels, Judah Maccabee parts 1 and 2. And it's that story that embodies, like I say, it's like one of the only times in their history since the exile where the Jews, for a period of 10 or 20 years or something like that, they had freedom. They had an amount of freedom that allowed them to, engage in their faith, unmolested, so to speak. But eventually it wore back down, and they had civil wars and such, and then Rome ends up coming in and taking over eventually, So that's the big picture context of all of this. That's what drew me to the story. That was what's interesting. It's kind of like a Braveheart story too. I wrote it in a way that's kind of similar to Braveheart because there was a lot of similarities, and I love that kind of story. So I've even got romance and action and battles and angels and demons as well. So it's a big picture thing going on.
Hey, Brian, so you write a lot of historical fiction, and I was just, if you don't mind going into your craft a little bit, how do you sort of make your decisions as far as, okay, this, to keep the story going, I need to put in fiction here, and how do I make this plausible? This is plausible because of this, and could you go into that just a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I've done this with all my Bible stories, So Judah Maccabee is part of my series Chronicles of the Watchers. That the premise of that is based on the notion that the Bible talks about there being spiritual powers or authorities over nations and kings, or over earthly authorities. There are spiritual authorities, and they're connected or they're linked. So if there's a war on earth, there's a war in heaven, and that goes out throughout the Bible. Daniel 10 talks about that, right? The prince of Persia, and the prince of Greece. And so there's a heavenly connection, and part of that is the Gentile nations all have these false gods over them, and there's a demonic reality to them. That's the premise of my story. What if the ancient gods of the world, like Zeus and Hera and Apollo and all this, what if they were actually demonic entities, or a demonic reality behind those that they worshiped, and that they were these fallen angels that the Bible talks about who became principalities over these Gentile nations? That Gentile nations did not worship God, so they're under the authority of these pagan deities, whereas God has his people for his own. And that the story of the Old Testament is that fighting against those territorial powers. And so that's the premise of the series. And so I've written Moses against the gods of Egypt. I've written Jezebel, harlot queen of Israel, and now Judah Maccabee. But like I said, it's Apocrypha, it's not scripture, but because it's connected, I kind of find that cool. It doesn't have to be connected because I think it's applicable to the whole world no matter what.
Oh, yeah.
So in other words, I've been retelling Bible stories. And of course, I believe the Bible is the word of God. And so I'm not going, I consider it holy and sacred. And so I don't want to trample on it or add to the word of God. But the concept of novels, storytelling, fiction storytelling is when you're retelling the Bibles, even if you're a pastor, right? And you're preaching a sermon, you're retelling the story. What are you doing? You're giving the context that the Bible doesn't necessarily have, right? In those days, they did this, right? And so you're telling your story and you're adding from extra biblical sources. Well, that's kind of what I do. I draw from other ancient Jewish legends and Christian legends and texts like the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha and lots of things. And I draw from them to fill in the gaps between what the Bible says and what it doesn't say, because the Bible only gives us the highlights. We don't know most of Moses' life, right? We don't know most of his first 40 years. It's just few incidents, his birth, and then he's 40 years old, and then he's 80 years old, and we hear, but what happened in between? So I'm trying to fill in those gaps, just like with Judah Maccabee, and I'm respecting the text of the Maccabees from the Apocrypha. I don't believe it's scripture, but I'm using it as a historical source. And
it doesn't mean it's. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just because it's not scripture,
you have to interrupt me.
No, just because it's not scripture, doesn't mean it's not true. And a lot of evangelical, we have problems with that, and we need to get out of that whole mindset.
Yeah, and I have to apologize for making reference to this all the time, because I know that a lot of Christians are very sensitive about this, and they don't think. Sometimes Christians don't think through things. They hear things and they have knee-jerk reactions. They don't think them through. So I have to spell it out. And sorry if that's condescending, but I find I have to do that so that people aren't. And we all do it. Don't we all have knee-jerk reactions to things here and there, right? So I'm just trying to make sure people understand that. But nevertheless, yes, what I do is I not only come up with fictional characters as well as the historical characters in order to make the story gel and make it interesting and relevant and such. And I do standard fictional things that everyone has to do. Even the Bible does it, where you telescope events or characters. Like you may have to combine several characters into one, because you can't tell every character in a story, right? You have to focus on the most important. Sometimes you have to combine, like in my book, there's a lot of battles in Judah, in the books of the Maccabees. I don't want to tell all the battle stories, but some important things happen in several battles, and I may combine several battles into one battle from my novel, but I'm still basing it on what really happened in some way, right? And so those are typical fictional things where the goal is to stay true as much as you can to the actual text and as true to the spirit of it with the fiction that you add. But I have a third component where I also draw back the curtain and try to show the supernatural world. What are these angels and demons that are fighting? What might that look like? And obviously it's speculation, but I'm trying to stay true to that spirit. And so I tell the story of, if these territorial powers are over these nations, what might that look like? Because for instance, the Greek kingdom, the Seleucid kingdom is Greek. So their gods are Zeus and Hera, right? But they're over in the Levant, or they're over in Israel, in Syria, actually, right? So they have Syria and Mesopotamia and Israel. And so those territorial gods then have gone with that power. So they're now ruling over that land. And then down in Egypt, you've got the Egyptian gods, Horus and Ra, and they're all these demonic entities. but they're battling each other because they're like mafia. They're like mafia or gangs of evil thugs. Yeah, they're all united in trying to defeat God and Yahweh, but in the midst of that, just like in normal gangs, you have people jockeying for power, and overthrowing the big guy so that they can be the big boss. And that's not just human. That's created persons. All are like that. Many Christians have thought that. Well, I'm going down the rabbit trail, but anyway, so that's kind of my mode for how to write fiction. I'm trying to stay true to the spirit of it, trying to stay true to the facts that we do. I try never to contradict, but I will, if I come up with something creative, trying to make it like it could be, it fits with what we do know, but then I'm also bringing in some supernatural, spiritual things that are obviously speculative.
So, Brian, you and I, we'd spoke a bit about your fiction novel with Judas Maccabees, but you'd also written a book on the history of theology, et cetera, that's background information for other people to read. And history has this really eerie way of like repeating itself. For example, in the story with the Maccabees, we've got them outnumbered, outgunned by a regime that really wants to just wipe them off the face of the planet. And it sounds an awful lot like the struggles that we see today. And I'm wondering if when you're writing out not just the novel, but also the background information of this, did you just ever get the feeling that this isn't really just ancient history? This is almost a blueprint for something that's like bigger happening now, and maybe even something that's unfolding for us in the future?
Well, I don't see it prophetically in that sense, but I do see it analogically. And I cannot help, as a writer in the modern day world of the 21st century, I cannot help but be informed by what's going on. And I do see similarities, and I make connections sometimes, and you try to do so because you don't want to be preachy or propagandizing. So I do try to make some connections, here and there for sure. But yeah, I think you're right that history repeats itself. And in fact, all tyrants do often operate and say the same things many times. Like, they often tend to see themselves as gods. Now, in the ancient world, it was more literal, right? I am the god, I am Marduk on earth, or I am Ra on earth. But now, oh no, they don't believe that. But they actually do believe they're gods because they believe that they're above normal people, and they don't have to operate by the same moral strictures because that's for the little people. You know what I'm saying? So, and some of them do have megalomaniac, ideas and stuff. You look at Iran and the mullahs and the Khomeini and all that kind of stuff. They think that way too. So there's obvious connections, but I just think that's the cyclical nature of human nature, because human nature is sinful. So therefore, we're always trying to build the Tower of Babel. Actually, if you want to pick one thematic narrative that is the most repetitive throughout history, I would say it's the Tower of Babel. We want to unify in our evil against God, because we hate when I say we, I mean generally the human race, not the Christians, obviously, but human race kind of wants to unify and become like gods, transhumanism, right? Mm-hmm. All this stuff. And of course they hate God. They want to be their own God. They want to be in control of their lives. They want to control other people's lives. And they're building the Tower of Babel, but it always falls. I mean, it always does, right? So that's the cycle, I guess.
Well, while we have you there, that's a good jumping off point to talk about something that was in your history book about the cosmic mountains and that whole motif. Can you go into all that kind of stuff and how that interplays in with Maccabees and the Tower of Babel and all that stuff? I mean, it's there.
Yeah, boy. So in the book, Spiritual World of Ancient Israel and Greece, I do have a whole detailed section on the cosmic mountain. And this is a concept that it goes throughout the whole Bible in many different ways and aspects. But let's just say this, in the ancient world for sure, including the Jews, they understood that gods resided on mountains. Sometimes they built their houses, which are their temples. They built their houses on mountains. So if you look, and certainly around the ancient Near East, that's the case. You have Mount Zaphon in Syria was where Baal, and they had a temple of Baal literally built up there, but that's where the mythology of Baal, who was the god of Canaan and that god of Syria area, he was the high storm god of the Canaan area. He was on Mount Zaphon. That was on the coast, right? Mount Hermon is a mountain that finds its place in the Bible, in a very crucial place. And then in intertestamental literature, we hear more that Mount Hermon, which is in the Lebanon mountain range, north in Syria, just east of Zaphon, northeast of Zaphon. That is a famous mountain that the Watchers supposedly came down and then mated with the humans and bore them the Nephilim. That's what the Book of Enoch talks about. But it's also the location where I believe it's not spelled out explicitly, but it's pretty provable that that's where Jesus was transfigured. Actually.
Yeah. The popular story, it was Mount Nebo, but I agree.
Or Tabor. Or is
Tabor.
It the same? Yeah.
It might be the same.
Right. But the problem is it says he went up to a high mountain, and Tabor is not high. None of those are high around there. The high mountain around there is Hermon.
Hermon, yeah.
Not only that, but before that, he was at the gates of Hades, which is at the foothills of Mount Hermon in Caesarea Philippi. That was called the gates of Hades. So when he says the gates of Hades will not overcome my kingdom, that's what he's talking about. And then what does he say? Upon this rock, I will build my church, my people. Well, that's not talking about Peter being the rock, and it's not talking about the confession being the rock. It's talking about Mount Hermon, because if you go back into the Bible, there's actually a really interesting passage in Psalm 68, and it talks about this battle of mountains. So Mount Hermon was also considered the mountain of El. El was also a god, a Canaanite god, and he was technically the high god, the sky god, and Baal was beneath him, but El was sort of a do-nothing deity, sort of like a Joe Biden god, right? He doesn't really do anything. And, and he just sort of like sleeps and literally falls asleep. He gets drunk and he poops in his pants. I kid you not. But anyway, but seriously though, but then the storm god Baal has to conquer the sea dragon Leviathan and become the high god of the pantheon. But El had his mountain. His mountain was Mount Hermon as well. And there's other, in the ancient world, like in the plains of Mesopotamia, where the Tower of Babel originally was, right? They have no mountains. The mountains are far to the east in the Zagros. But they believe gods reside on mountains and communicating with man on mountains. So what did they do? They built their man-made mountains. The ziggurats are man-made mountains. So they even gave them names like the mountain of, or the temple of of heavens and earth. And they believe that at the top of the mount of the ziggurats, they would have a temple where they would interact with the gods. And so that's their mountain, and then that's where their god resides. So that's another description of Mount Olympus was where the Greek gods were. So it goes on and on and on. But the idea here is that, so they believed God resides on mountains. Mountains were the connecting points between heaven and earth. And that's why the temple was the god's house or tent. He either pitches a tent or builds a temple in the mythologies and such. And the mountains became a connecting point between heavens and earth and the underworld. So like in the same way that you might climb a mountain and meet God as he comes down from the heavens, and that's what the Tower of Babel was, coming down, and they would go up. But also the roots of mountains, if you look at the mythologies and such, particularly in the Canaanite and Ugaritic texts, you see that the mountains had their roots that go down into the underworld. So it's a very spiritual thing. So mountains became their God's fortresses of their religion. So even the Jews, they would refer to Mount Sinai, where God met them, gave his law and such. But then as time went on and he established his city in Jerusalem, Jerusalem was called Mount Zion. Yeah. Now, it's not a high mountain, but it is elevated. So the point there is it's elevated enough, and God built his house on Mount Zion. And so even God himself does this, in a way he accommodates to this notion, right, that we have.
So Brian, how does this tie into Eden? Does this all come back to Eden? Wasn't Eden on a mountain as well? I mean, isn't that the general?
Yeah. There's a passage in, I think it's Ezekiel 28.
They say it's about Lucifer, but and
that's a different issue. We don't need to talk about that. But he's talking about Eden. You were in Eden, the Garden of God. Actually, the prophecy is about the king of Tyre. It says so. Right? Yeah. So it's talking about this man this king. Tyre and Sidon were very great nations on the coast. Phoenician, they were powerful and all this for hundreds of years. And he thought he was a god, that kind of thing. And so he's mocking him. He's saying, and he's likening the king of Tyre to, well, there's different theories. I think it's Adam, but nonetheless, it says, you were in Eden, the garden of God, and he's describing all these sapphires and stones. And on the day you were created, you were an anointed guardian cherub. Actually, the Septuagint says you were with the guardian cherub. I placed you on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. And so, but what is he saying? He's saying you were in Eden, the garden of God. So was this literally a garden on a mountain? I don't know, but certainly the narrative of it is Eden is described as a mountain. It's also described as a garden, which is also described as a temple where God resides. And so God resides in his temple in Eden on the mountain of God. And by the way, Eden is a country. It's not just a garden.
Yeah.
It's a country. It could very well be a garden on a literal mountain. I don't know, but it's being described theologically that way in the text. That's where they kind of get that notion. But here's the cool thing. Here's where I'm actually getting to is Psalm 68 is where so battles between religions or gods is a battle of cosmic mountains. And this does actually occur in multiple places even in, you talk about Revelation and, Armageddon actually is not the Valley of Megiddo. It's actually, if you look at the Greek, there's some problems there with the Greek, and it's probably the Mount of Assembly. But that is also where this final battle comes, right? And on a mountain, on a mount. But in Psalm 68 specifically, it talks about, O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan. What is that? Well, Mount Hermon that we were talking about, which is where the Jews understood it was an evil mountain because it was where they understood the Watchers came down, and it was their pagan deity El also had that, right? So they considered it evil. It was in the land of Bashan. Bashan means place of the serpent. Surprise, right? And that is actually part of the ruled area of the last Rephaim, right? The giant. He ruled Bashan. So part of when Joshua came in, what did he do before they took the promised land? He conquered Og of Bashan. He conquered the place of the serpent. So there's that battle. But in Psalm 68, it's describing not that battle, but the hostilities between the two faiths. So, O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan, that's Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon was the mountain of Bashan. O many-peaked mountain, mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with hatred, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount that God desired for his abode? Yes, where the Lord will dwell forever. Where's that? That mountain looks with hatred upon God's mountain. The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. You ascended on high. And it says down near the bottom, the Lord will strike the heads of it. The Lord said, I will bring them back from Bashan. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea. If you look in the rest of Psalm 68, I'm sorry, I skipped over it. Thousands upon thousands of angels surrounding God. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. So Mount Sinai is described as this mountain of God, the symbol of the Jewish faith, and Bashan hates it. There's that hatred. The cosmic mountains are enmity, right? But God's, of course, going to take over Bashan because that's what Joshua does, and they conquer it. And of course, if you keep reading down right after it talks about Sinai, it says this, you ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train and receiving gifts among men. What does that sound like? Didn't we hear that in the New Testament? In Ephesians, it talks about Jesus. That was Jesus who did that. So this is actually looking forward to, I think, Mount Zion ultimately, right? Because Jesus was the one who ascended on high, and he's the ultimate enemy of Mountain of Bashan. So here, this is where you've got this poetic language of the war of cosmic mountains, and it goes much deeper than that throughout the whole Bible. It's just a fascinating study in and of itself. I think the Bible Project has done like a dozen podcasts on it on cosmic mountain. That's a good place to look.
Well, yeah, I mean, you see the mountains and you see the courtroom theme. You see the council theme throughout the entire Bible too. It's like there's two really big themes there. That's fascinating.
Yeah, no, you're right. The chariots of God, that's those who surround his throne, and his throne is a courtroom throne, right? That's how it's always described. So in a way, that's his courtroom throne, and that's his divine counsel. Absolutely.
Well, I just wanted to interject something that I thought was really interesting. You were talking about the history and the cyclic nature of history and stuff. I have a friend who says when he reads the Bible, he loves it because he knows what's going on behind the scenes with the supernatural and all that kind of stuff. But then he reads a normal history book, like he'll read the Civil War history. He's like, all right, well, what were the angels doing in Gettysburg? And he like wishes he had a background. let's talk about that some. You went into the many myriad of battles and stuff. So talk about some of the, like, a significant battle and how you brought the supernatural into it with the gods conflicting.
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of unique, Judah Maccabee is a kind of a unique novel from the rest of my series in that, because remember how I mentioned God has in a sense withdrawn relationally from Israel. So there's not as much of his direct, obvious activity, but
Right.
God is always
Yeah.
sovereign behind the scenes, orchestrating history for sure.
Like Esther. I mean, he's not there, but he's there. Yeah.
You don't hear the name, but he's there, right?
Yep.
So there's that. So in principle, first, I want to finish the Cosmic Mountain. There's one other thing about that was kind of interesting. So in my novel series, I have the gods of Olympus, Greek gods. In this time period, Rome was arising and becoming a strong power. They were a republic. So much so that the Greek kingdom had to kind of back off and obey, and Rome was taking over that region. They'd taken over some of Macedonia and some of Greece. And so the gods of Olympus were kicked off their mountain, basically. But then they're over in Syria, and I have all this in my story. And then they kicked off Baal from Saphon, because that's in Syria, and they took over his mountain. So he goes down to Egypt. And if you look in history, there was a Semitic community in Egypt for a long time, not just the Jews, but Semitic community. And they brought the worship of Baal and Anat and several of their Canaanite deities. I try to make the activities of the gods or the fallen angels, whatever you want to call them, the watchers. I try to reflect what's going on historically, if that makes sense. And then, and then there's also some events that occur on Mount Hermon, as well in my story. So I try to make that an interesting narrative reality beyond just a theological thing. But then to your point about the spiritual war. So that's the other thing that, my novels are all, deal with a lot of spiritual warfare. And there's an interesting thing that's going on in the books of the Maccabees. So there's two different books of there's four, but there's two that really tell the story that I'm retelling in a way that's more historical. And one of the books, the first Maccabees, there's no stories of angels, and there's no references to resurrection, the resurrection, right? The future resurrection. But in the second Maccabees, we hear when the martyrs are being martyred that I mentioned to you earlier, each one of the sons who are going to be martyred, they stand up against the king and say, I don't care what you do to my body, king, because I will regain it in the resurrection. All of them appeal to the fact that they're going to be resurrected, so they're not afraid to die. This is a very unique thing you have to realize, because there's no reference like that in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And this intertestamental time is where that understanding of the resurrection sort of grew. And the Maccabees is a point of time where that really becomes strong. And there's also a couple stories about seeing angels in golden chariots and stuff battling in the skies, and even some of them riding in golden chariots through the streets of Alexandria, Egypt. Why? Because that was when King Antiochus Epiphanes was surrounding, Alexandria, and he didn't end up having the actual battle, so that didn't occur. But the idea there was they're saying that normal people are getting a glimpse into the heavens and seeing that there's heavenly war going on here.
And real quick, Brian, there's similar stories, I want to say, from Josephus around the time of the AD 70 fall of Jerusalem. Chariots and voices and things like that.
You're right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I drew from Josephus and those stories. I put them in my other series called Chronicles of the Apocalypse. That's a whole other series telling the story of the book of Revelation in the first century when it happened. Nero's persecuting the Christians and John's writing the Revelation. What's going on? So I did that in that series as well. So I drew from it. But here's what's interesting. Why is there such a distinct difference, right, between these two books? And this is where scholars will say that this is where the origins of the Sadducee and Pharisee difference happened. Because of the Maccabean success, they established a new kind of rule in Judaism with the Maccabees, but everybody had very differing ideas, right? And this is where the Sadducees ultimately came out of. So they think proto-Sadducean, a Sadducee before they had Sadducees. In other words, it came out of this. A proto-Sadducean probably wrote First Maccabees, because what does the New Testament say? Sadducees don't believe in angels or resurrection. Isn't that interesting? The two very strong connections are made in the New Testament, almost as if like the writers know about this, right? And then Pharisees do believe in the resurrection, and they do believe in angels. And so probably a Pharisee wrote second Maccabees, or a proto-Pharisee, if that makes sense. And then the Essenes, which we know about in the first century, they were the ones who were the monastic ones who went out in the wilderness at Qumran, and they're the ones that we get the Dead Sea Scrolls from. They also came out of this time period ultimately, and they had their own ideas about, like, they believed in the Zadokite priesthood, and so they withdrew because, why? Because the Hasmonean priesthood that came out of the Maccabees was not Zadokite, so the Essenes withdrew. Yeah. So that's where all this stuff, this time period of the Maccabees is really crucial for setting up for the New Testament. There's got a lot of factors to it, you know. I think I went off on a tangent.
I mean, you don't hear about this in the average Sunday morning in church. No, I bet, you know, even in the Anglican church, Apocrypha is part of our lectionary. But I mean, I've never heard a sermon based on first or second Maccabees. I don't know if BT even has. You know, we stay in the New Testament most of the time.
Yeah,
yeah. But
yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, it's so important. It's so important. I saw that when I was reading your book. I'm like, wow, there needs to be a theology class just on this.
Yeah, totally.
Yep.
You know, the first century Christians, when they were being persecuted and dying for their faith, they drew a lot of their inspiration from the Maccabees because of the martyrs, remember? And that was where, it's not like people had never been martyred for their faith, but that was a turning point where martyrdom became having the opposite effect that the bad guys wanted, you know, where it's like it started becoming a rallying point for a revolution or rising up, right? Now, of course, the Christians didn't do that, but they still looked to the faithfulness of the Maccabees as their inspiration to remain true to their faith in Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Wow. It's amazing.
Wild stuff.
Your work weaves together history, theology, the supernatural, all this. What, if you could summarize, and we kind of land this plane, what should modern Christians take out of this? What is the takeaway you want people when they read your books to get and to, you know, have his knowledge, but also to apply to their lives? What would you think that would be?
Yeah, well, you know, I'll be frank. My purpose in storytelling is driven by my own purpose of how I understand the Bible to be read. And what I mean is, I know that a lot of modern day Christians and evangelicals of that stripe, they tend to see the Bible as, you know, a manual for how to live our lives. And while that is certainly in a sense true, obviously, but they read it to find out, what can I do? How can I be better? Or how can I, whatever, how
Self-help book.
What things can I do? Yeah. Or it's all about application. And that I'm all for application, but my point is, I believe that our goal in reading the scriptures is primarily, first and foremost, to find God. And you find God in seeing how he works through history in the redemption of his people, because it's a story, right?
Right.
And you find God in seeing how he's depicted and how he's described poetically, symbolically, all these things. So you're reading the text to find God. Yes, then there are applications in your life, but that's the primary focus. So I retell these stories to try to help people, to point them back to God, faith in God, in the Creator, in Jesus, you know, in the Trinity, and that's all part of it. And a sovereign God who's sovereignly in control of history.
Yeah.
You know, not this sort of like, I wonder, you know, I sure hope that everything will
works
do right.
out.
And and I put my righteous man there. I hope he does the thing. No, he's in control, like Daniel describes, right? He raises kings and he makes them fall. He's in control. And that's definitely another theme of my stories, that why I write them, is I want to show God's sovereign glory, you know? So those are some of the main reasons why I write it. So, and the other thing is actually to see, one of the reasons why I started writing the whole thing back in 15 years ago with Chronicles of the Nephilim. That was the first series. Then Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and now Chronicles of the Watchers. They're all the same paradigm. They're all retelling story. They can all integrate, basically, is what I'm saying. They're different series, but they're just, you know, sort of like I finished a series and I realized, I had to write more, you know? So, but my whole goal in that was to retell Bible stories with this fresh new perspective that I had picked up, that I had not seen in the Bible before, that went woven throughout the whole text, which is the divine counsel worldview, this notion of the watcher paradigm and the giants. Is that just a strange anomaly? Something for us to talk about with UFOs and all this kind of stuff? No. There's a theological thread throughout the Bible that it's all linked to. And this stuff blew my mind. And I saw the Bible afresh and in an exciting way. And I believe my goal is to try to help people re-explore the biblical text through the eyes of an ancient Hebrew. In other words, when we read the Bible, oftentimes we don't know the context. I mean, we can pick up some of it, yes. But I'm just saying in general, there's a lot of things, a lot of background things to the Bible that we don't know as moderns. And even just the way we think, we don't, like we think very scientifically. Even if we're Christians and we believe in the supernatural and we don't worship science, we still think scientifically.
Yeah.
They didn't. And you have to, what was that like? How did they think and how did they talk because of that? How did they see the world really? And my goal is to help us see these ancient stories in the Bible through the ancient culture and how they understood it, which brings in all these things that make people go, wow. And ultimately, I want people to go back and reread the Bible. And honestly, I've been getting a lot of responses. I do ads for my books on Facebook, and I got a lot of people responding, and a lot of people have really been telling me it has reinvigorated their desire to read the Bible.
Yeah.
It's not that this becomes a substitute. It's that they get it. They realize, no, this helps me see the Bible in a fresh way. So when I read the text, it makes more sense to me now.
Well, and your literature, the way you write, and literature is ultimately a form of art, and art is all about beauty. And in this, we see the beauty of God. And I think that is so fundamental. We talk about it, and he talks about the beauty of his holiness, the beauty and the beauty of God. And that is attractive to people. I mean, that's what we fall in love with these fictional and this literature. That's why the whole Bible is written as literary type in form is we fall in love with the story, and the story, it just happens that the person in the story is God. I mean, that's how I see it. So
yeah, that's my goal.
Yep. And it comes out in your work. So yeah, definitely.
Thank you. It's a lot of hard work. I put it takes me a year to write a book. Sometimes I can write 2 books in a year, but at least a year I give, like the next one's going to.
That's still good though. A year is still good for a book though.
Yeah. But it's like a lot of research behind everything. And so that's one of the reasons why I write these research books to go along with it, because I knew people are going to go like, is he making this stuff up? Because a lot of it's wild, right? It's like, well, and even the stuff that is speculative, like Leviathan, right? Leviathan shows up in all my novels. He's the sea dragon of chaos. Well, that's in the Bible. I got it from the Bible, right? Yeah. But it's like, I want to give them the basis so that they realize, oh, this isn't made up. And not only that, but this is wild and cool. And then when they read this novels, then they understand it, where it's coming from. And it almost like they understand it better. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was inspired by Michael Crichton. You remember him? He's a great storyteller,
Great.
And he at the end of each sci-fi stuff, right? From the Terminal Man all the way to, Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park, right?
Right.
But he would give an appendix at the back of his novels where he would explain the real science based on that his fiction was based on. And I got inspired by that. And I started doing that with my Chronicles of the Nephilim. I would write an appendix. Then I ended up going like, well, there's so much research I want to add that I started having with Chronicles of the Watchers. I now have a separate book for each novel. And if you want to get the Bible research and stuff, you can do that. But there's a lot of people who don't. They just love this. They get it. They get it from the story, and that's fine. Either way is fine. One of the things else that I do is so part of educating on, this ancient worldview is whatever ancient religion is interacting with Israel. In this case, the Maccabees, we have the Greek religion, right? That's a unique one. That's one of the, and that's, by the way, that's another reason why I wrote it, because I have all these different gods of the nations, watchers of the nations. I've got Babylon, I've got Egypt, and I'm like, okay, I know this has to do with Greece. So
are Rome and Greece pretty much interchangeable? Is that how you do those?
They are. Yeah. Rome basically stole from Greece and just renamed them.
Yeah.
But the Grecian gods and all that kind of stuff, I've never dealt with that. And I thought that's another good reason to write this story.
Yeah.
I want to educate people a little bit about these religions because I find their mythologies fascinating. So what I tend to do is I tend to draw from their mythologies and put those stories that are in the mythologies into the story of the gods in my story. So for example, I'll just hint at this. Do you know anything about Heracles, right? The famous Heracles.
Yeah.
You know his 12 labors, right?
Yeah.
Well, those are all part of mythology, but let's just put it this way. I have a way of bringing Heracles into this story, and you'll learn a little bit about his labors in this storyline.
That's pretty cool.
But I apply it in the spiritual realm to the gods and all that because, I don't believe their mythology is true, but I'm just I'm just saying when you read my story about what's going on with the gods of Greece, you're going to learn about actual Greek mythology and religion. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
In a way, and to me, it's always in context as a rival to Israel and Israel's God Yahweh. And I always see it like this. I see it like the way C.S. Lewis talked about Narnia. Remember, Narnia has all these pagan creatures in there, but they're all submitted to Aslan, right? And so that's how I see it. Everything's submitted to Yahweh ultimately because he's the king over all creation, but they exist within his world,
Yeah. I mean, I grew up reading Heracles and the myths and all that as a kid. I mean, that was my favorite stuff to read, And
you read about Zeus being a randy adulterer. That's in my story.
Yeah.
He goes with humans and with gods and goddesses all alike, and his personality. And Hera was jealous of that. And that's one of the reasons why she was trying to punish Heracles, right?
Yeah.
And so all that's in my story as well. Yeah. I try to carry it over realistically.
Well, and you talked about his name being born of Hera.
Glory of Hera or something like that.
Glory of Hera. Yeah.
I've always heard him Hercules. So, but his real name is Heracles. That makes more sense,
Hercules is the Roman. And obviously Rome just conquered and took over. So that's why we know most of the stuff we know. Well, no, I mean, we know Zeus better than Jupiter. I would say that's true. And Hera versus Jupiter and Minerva. So, I guess in some ways the Greek. Well, that's the interesting thing. By the time the Romans come into the picture, they are what's the word? What's the derogatory word that appropriate? They're master appropriators. Mm-hmm. There's probably multiple reasons why they did it, but they did it well. They would conquer whatever. They'd conquer an area, and they would just absorb their culture into the Roman culture and change it and adapt it and sort of keep it. And that's what they did with the Greeks. And if you remember, like in the first century, Rome was the ruler of the world, of the known world at that time, right? But what did they speak? They all spoke Greek still because they did acknowledge that Greece had a glorious artistic, you're talking about artistic culture and background, and their language was powerful and beautiful, and it linked to the world economically and all this. So the Romans were very practical, I guess is what I'm getting at, and they were able to do that in a way so that even in the first century, we still had the issue of Hellenism, which is Greekifying everything, and that was an aspect of compromise,
kind of taking up where Alexander left off there, I guess.
Exactly.
Well, you kind of touched on this, and I'm about to land this plane, but I want to go here to you discussed, how the Septuagint played such a huge role in shaping early Christian theology, and you were just talking about the Greek language. So how did the Greek translation of the Old Testament influence the way Jesus and the apostles interpreted Scripture?
Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. So I knew a little bit about the Septuagint, but I didn't know much. And researching about it, because the Apocrypha drew me into the Septuagint. And I have a little bit about that in my book, but it's a whole big topic to go into. And I'm fascinated now. So I'm now reading books on the Septuagint because I come to realize that it's far more important to our Christian faith than many Christians realize. And why? Well, we all say, the original language of the Old Testament was Hebrew. So we assume, we have the Hebrew text now, and so that's the superior text. Well, it turns out that's not actually true. And the Hebrew text that we have comes from the Masoretes, which were the scribes who did it. And that was the earliest we have, I think, is like 1100 AD. But I think maybe it went, sometime around before 600 or so, the Masoretes. Actually, what they did was this. They actually gathered together scriptures and retranslated them back into Hebrew. But the reason why they did that was,
it's conspiracy theory, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Doug Van Dorn talked about it this week to us. He's like, this is the ultimate conspiracy theory. Yep.
But it's really cool because, but it made you think about how close the Septuagint is to the original texts. So the Septuagint is basically the Greek translation of the Bible, right? I'll just say that. It's a generic term, But and that began back in 250 BC with the Greek leader Ptolemy Philadelphus, and he had the Alexandrian Library, which was the greatest library in the ancient world, and he wanted the text there, and he had a Jewish community there, so he went and got Jewish scribes, and they translated into Greek. But what's interesting is, think about this. What's so powerful and glorious is that became the standard because because the Jews also became Hellenized. Yeah, a lot of the scribes and stuff still spoke Hebrew, but the Greek text of the Bible, of the Old Testament, became the standard scripture for them.
Even in the synagogues and stuff? That's what.
And even in the synagogues.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Cool.
So much so that by the time of the first century, the apostles and Jesus are quoting from the Greek Old Testament. About 80% of their quotes in the Old Testament, now scholars will say it's from the Septuagint, what we call the Septuagint now. There's qualifications on that, but let's just say that for now, from the Septuagint. And that's interesting because as Christians, right, if Jesus is quoting from that and the apostles are, then that lends a certain level of, you could say, authority or at least value, right, to those translations. Yeah. I'm not saying they're perfect because there are a lot of problems with, we've got, if you know anything about text criticism and textual transmission of the Bible, there's a lot of problems and issues that we have to face as Christians. It doesn't scare me though, but my point is that, think about it, 250 BC, that's far close. When did was it Josiah who discovered the texts in the temple? So that's like 250 BC when they did the translation. In other words, they had access to texts of the Old Testament that were closest to the originals that we have, right? And the ones that the Masoretes did are like way later. Not only that, but because Jesus and the apostles used the Greek Testament, think about this. If it would have just stayed in Hebrew, the world wouldn't know about it because the Hebrews were just this little tribe, right? And they had their little scriptures and nobody spoke Hebrew, so who cared, right? But because they did it into Greek, all the world could read them. And that is what allowed the propagation of the gospel to go forth, is the Greek language, the Koine Greek. And that's why we were able to spread the gospel throughout the whole world. That's glorious. And to me, that's God's sovereign control, right?
Yep.
But then if you've already had a guy talk about it, then he probably would go into more detail. But the problem is that the Jews who rejected Messiah in the first century, and when the temple was destroyed, they were scattered and most of them went away. But there were a few rabbis and priests who went to Titus, the Roman general, and asked to have, in Jamnia, they have their own little school where they can revitalize their faith without a temple. And that's where they created Rabbinic Judaism, which is not biblical Judaism. It's Judaism without the temple, without the Old Testament. And that's where you get all the oral laws and all that kind of stuff.
The Talmud.
But then they were so angry that so many Jews were becoming Christians by using the Greek that they wanted, we want to have our own scriptures that are superior. And then that's why they did their Hebrew translations. But if you look into the origins of the Masoretic text and you compare it to other texts that we now have, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, you see that some very key passages about Messiah were changed because they're obviously connected to Jesus. They obviously point to Jesus. And the Christians were using those to get Jews saved. So they changed them in the text. And this is why I think I'm not saying that the Masoretic text is completely corrupt and evil, but I'm just saying, if you look at textual criticism, it's not always the best text to go to, but Christians always assume, well, that's the best text, but it's not. Yeah. Not always. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Doug was just pointing out all the conspiracies through history and
Wait, who was on?
Doug Van Dorn.
Oh, Doug Van Dorn. Okay.
Yeah. And we were just talking about conspiracy theories, and he was pointing out the ones through history, and he said, you just point out that that's a huge one in our history of the Bible is a conspiracy.
And I just kind of stumbled upon this in my preparation for reading the novel, and now I'm still on it because I'm like, okay, I got several books I'm reading on the Septuagint.
It's fascinating.
It's fascinating. Yeah. Now, when I'm going to read Old Testament text, I'm not going to just go back to the Hebrew. I'm going to go back to the Septuagint as well. And because sometimes their Septuagint verses are better. Let me give you this is the smoking gun, I think, that should prove it to any Christian. And that is, the classic verse is Isaiah 7:14. Behold, the virgin shall bear a child. And it's like, you know what? The New Testament clearly quotes the Greek Parthenos for virgin. And the Masoretic text has Alma, which is not a virgin, it's a maiden, it's a young woman, right? And there's a classic case. And that, to me, that's the worst. That's the most monstrous of all because, right? I mean, doesn't it clearly say right there, they're doing it because they don't want Jews to realize that Jesus was prophesied, born of a virgin. And that's what the Christians are saying,
When they hit a lot of the two powers aspect, that the angel of the Lord stuff, and then the genealogies was fascinating to me. Doug went into the genealogies of Melchizedek and who was the patriarch, Lindsay? They said
Shem?
that he was Yeah,
Shem?
I think Shem. Yeah, and
They think that Shem was Melchizedek. Yeah.
Yeah, they changed the genealogies. They added years or took away years or something like that. Anyway, that was just fascinating. That just blew me away. I mean,
the ages. That's something I haven't gotten into yet, but I've just seen about it. The ages of the patriarchs are different, like by 1,000 years between the Masoretic and I haven't looked into that yet.
Yeah, it's just mind blowing. But I just think that's important. I mean, and I've heard people that were like, and I'm gonna knock on them a little bit, King James only type people, like it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Well, you can say that about the Septuagint,
Yeah, that's the irony of it all, is that they really think like it's the purest form and all this, and those poor suckers don't even realize. Oh my gosh, you don't even realize your version is based on the corrupted
text. Yep.
Anti-Christian text in some ways, right? In some ways,
yeah.
The Masoretic text, and Jesus didn't quote your version, right? So it's like, whoa! I mean, to me, that's just the kick. That's just the smoking gun. That's the killer,
Yeah. Well, let's just kind of wrap this up. Any deets or have any details where people can find you?
Yeah. Reach me directly as Godawa.com. That's my name, my website, GODAWA.com. Everything's on there. I try to make it an interesting website with a lot of interesting things like cool free articles. And I cast all my novels. So if you look up you can find the novel, and then they'll have pictures of the cast. I got the giants. Cool. I got everything in there. It's really cool. And that's all free. You can access that. But if you want to just look right to the books, all my books are exclusively on Amazon in paperback, many hardcover, Kindle, as well as audiobook. And there's a lot of info, you know how it is.
This is a $10,000 question. Do you have any movie projects in the future with these books? Can you even talk about that?
Books? No, they're too expensive. My general thing that I explain to people is they're, $150 million movies or series, because there's a lot of fantastical things in it, a lot of big battles and wars and stuff like that. And even with the great, what CGI can do and stuff, you still need a lot of money to do CGI, to do big stuff.
Do it right, yeah.
And look, it's too biblical for Hollywood, and it's too creative for Christian producers, and too expensive. Christian movies can, make, a few $1 million, $10 million for a movie at most, but they can't raise $100 million. And they're frightened by the theology. A lot of them are still frightened by the theology. So
they're cheesy as crap.
They're cheesy as crap.
There you go. To be honest.
Let's be honest. Yeah.
But let's be fair. They're getting better. They're getting a lot better. And there's been some really good ones.
Angel Studios is getting better, even though they're kind of sus to me. Sound of Freedom, they're getting better.
To be fair, Sound of Freedom was made by Hollywood people outside of Hollywood's system because Hollywood wouldn't accept it, right?
Right.
Is it called Sound of Freedom? Was that it?
Yeah, with Jim Caviezel. Yeah.
So they just distributed it, right? But still, I've seen a couple of their Angel movies, and they're pretty good. Again, they need to get better, but they are getting better. And I won't mock them. Like in the past, you could easily mock a lot of these movies.
Right.
But not so much anymore. So I'm grateful and thankful for that. But they're still low budget and stuff, and they've got their genre, they've got their quirks about you have to have a Christian praying to receive Jesus in a church with a pastor all the time. They've got these things you have to have that I just can't stand.
You don't have the whole Left Behind series on your shelf, Brian?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Sorry, I had to go there. Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, Brian. Man, this has been
Brian.
Oh, it's been awesome. I've taken notes. I've just thoroughly enjoyed this, and I can't wait to dive into these novels. And I'm going to finish some of your other series. I've done the primeval, the beginning ones, Noah and those. So I love the audiobooks because I love to be read to with fiction.
Yeah. And I know I'm reading them and I know the material real well. So, but what's interesting, as you're following that series, the first 3 are more mythological. And once you get to Abraham, it starts to become more historical, which, by the way, I'm following the biblical pattern. If you look at the primeval history of Genesis 1 to 11, it's more what William Lane Craig calls mytho-history. It is historical, but it's not quite historical. It's somewhat mythological. So that's how I'm writing those first 3 books. But then you get to Abraham and it becomes a little bit more historical oriented, but I still have the spiritual stuff. So that's still going on,
Yeah. Awesome stuff. Well, thank you, Brian. I appreciate it.
You bet, man. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.